Okay, so the Hate Speaker project, I think, was one of our earliest projects that we started discussing this one in about 2019. It was on the back of a number of quite high-profile hate speaker tours to Australia. It was also on the back of a partnership we had with the Bridge Initiative in the US, and they were interested in looking at some of the sort of financial underpinnings of some of these tours, and we, during that time, for better or worse, agreed to look at the Australian context of some of these hate speaker tours. So this project, I guess, initially looked at a period of time, 2015 to 2019, and we identified 5 particular tours during that time that we then formed the basis of much of the research project for this. So we were looking, I think, in the first instance, about some of the far-right ideologies that underpinned many of these tours. We were looking at platforms that they were using in order to project, but also to disseminate some of that information. And we were broadly looking at some of the risks that they posed to Australian society and what some of the most effective mechanisms might be for disrupting some of those tours. So the 5 case studies, we then had a fourth sort of research question, I guess, that we were looking at, which was to try and sort of measure, I guess, what some of the that far-right hate speech, sort of the effect it had on people's political and financial support for the race hate tours. And we've actually just in the closing stages of a behavioural survey that we're doing on that. So I don't have the findings for that here today, but stay tuned for that aspect. But that's looking at like what effect people, like race hate speech, I guess, and ideology might have on people's actual capacity to financially support the hate speaker tours. So that is coming. But what I'm going to present to you today is the key findings that have come out, particularly from the case study aspect of this project. So the first one is just we're looking at the ideologies, and I guess associated with that is the harms for it. So first is that far-right hate ideologies defined these hate speaker tours. They include issues such as white supremacy, anti-Muslim, anti-immigration and misogynistic content. They also leveraged local issues, so concerns around political correctness, Indigenous and anti-asylum seeker sentiment were also quite prominent in the speech. Acts of hate were given substantial platforms through mainstream media, interviews and coverage, and also the support of key political figures. So at the time, Tony Abbott and Pauline Hanson, for example, were quite prominent. It had direct and consequent effects on society, and hate speaker tours were used as a means to mobilise and rally supporters for far-right extremism in Australia. The hate speech was allowed to fester in very volatile political climate where freedom of speech debates have grown increasingly hostile towards minority and vulnerable groups. And far-right speakers and their supporters erroneously, but quite purposefully, conflated the concepts of hate speech and freedom of speech in a lot of those debates. Hate speech had several negative effects. It altered norms, underpinning the sense of belonging and citizenship among minority groups, deteriorating community relations, and posed a threat to harmony and order. And I think despite the significant public discourse on the harmful impact and offensiveness of hate speech towards minorities in Australia, as well as the risks posed, we actually, in this research project, found very limited visible evidence that harm caused to minorities as a result of hate speech was ever a driving factor behind the banning of hate speech. So I'll talk a little bit particularly around regulation about what was effective, because that particular debate, which would be concerning for most of us, didn't have much of an impact in it. So the second sort of finding was around finances, and this one we were looking at a whole range of finances, like who supported, who funded, what impact it had on local businesses who were involved in it. So, for example, many of the tours actually used mainstream hotels here in Melbourne, for example, to host many of these tours. So it was looking at some of the sort of business aspects of that. What we did find was that economic disruptions such as protests and boycotts, particularly that targeted the associated businesses, did have some disruptive power, so something to think about for future events in this space. Barring hate speakers from online platforms and also demonetising those platforms had some effect on the financial viability of hate speaker tours, but it was hindered by a lack of transparency and accountability of the thresholds prescribed by those platform regulators. So there was inconsistency of how it was applied, and there was also a lack of transparency about what those parameters actually were. The costs associated with the operations of police and security agencies was another area of financial action. There was some inference that Milo Yiannopoulos' tour, he had 2 tours, one was in 2017, the 2018 one was cancelled, and there was some inference that from his 2017 tour there was a large unpaid Victoria Police bill associated with that tour. It went unpaid, and there was an inference that that had some impact on the cancellation of his visa for the 2018 tour. So there's some elements of perhaps intervention or disruption that can occur in that space as well. And there was also, I think, reason to believe that threats of fines could be a deterrence for future event organisers in that space. Quickly, in terms of regulation, so 2 things that we looked at here. One was platform regulation. So one of our findings here is an advocacy for greater regulation of the platforms where these views are espoused, either through barring hate speakers from the platforms or demonetising their activities on those platforms. And to be fair, a number of the hate speakers that we studied had at various times been deplatformed. But again, there was a lack of transparency as to why that was happening, and that wasn't always often that was a transitory barring from the platform. So they were back on it again at some point. There's little transparency or accountability from the platforms as to how and what threshold someone who espouses hate speech will be banned from the platform. So again, another aspect for the platforms and regulation. There's also a sense that the heat or attention that high-profile hate speakers gained from may contribute to whether or not they're banned from those sites. So we found that high-profile speakers were more likely to be banned for short periods of time, but then there's a whole bunch of maybe more low-hanging fruit that continues to operate on those sites that don't. So they ban them, make it a high-profile kind of case. They often come back onto the site, but then there's a lot of continued hate speech that occurs that never gets removed. The second thing that we looked at was government or legal sort of regulations that could have some effect here. So existing legislation such as the Racial Discrimination Act, and then also state and territory laws that prohibit hate speech, we found were not effective in preventing hate speakers from engaging in the promotion of far-right ideologies. And there's a whole range of reasons for that around legislation. An example, there's no criminal punishment, for example, that's attached to the Racial Discrimination Act. So if you go, if people are brought before that, there's no criminal punishment associated with that. It's also a very arduous and time-consuming process to put something, to make a claim against the Racial Discrimination Act, so that often when you're talking about far-right speakers who are here for a short period of time, it's not always viable. There's also, I think, when it comes to prosecuting under state and territory criminal laws that target vilification, there's a high standard of proof that needs to be proved, and so that wasn't necessarily an effective pathway either. Where we found maybe the greatest effect of a regulatory framework in this is has its own set of problems, I think, using this pathway, but it was where it was most effective, was the Minister's discretionary power under the Migration Act, most commonly used in terms of the character, character categorisation, I guess, around whether or not someone poses a threat to Australian society. So in the 2 cases where the tours were cancelled, which was Milo's 2018 tour and then also the Tommy Robinson tour of the same year, they were both cancelled on those character grounds. So that was the most effective use, I guess, of platform regulation in terms of banning hate speakers from entering Australia. And then the last thing, just quickly to talk about on this project, is just what I'm sort of, I guess, framing as establishing social norms around some of these issues. And there's just 2 points I want to make before I finish up on this one. One was that we found grassroots and political activism was an effective counter-speech approach, and also the no platforming sort of interventions that occurred in that space. It highlights the ongoing need to call out hate speech in order to establish the social norms and future discourses that can address and disrupt the systemic discrimination and racism that's perpetuated by hate speech. And I think a really important, in terms of ways forward as well, point to make is that in the interest of establishing those sort of strong social norms that devalue hate ideologies, set standards in society of what is acceptable and not in this kind of space, we need to really emphasise the need for strong opposing messages, particularly from civic and political leaders, a more critical mainstream media coverage of platform, the speakers and the platforms that they use. And as an example, many of those hate speaker tours that we looked at were given time and space on mainstream platforms to espouse some of those views. But also have the appropriate bodies to be more outspoken about the hate views expressed. And that's all important in terms of establishing those social norms in society around that particular issue of hate speech. And I will leave it there.